Today we will learn and reflect on the third autobiography of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a first-generation black leader and abolitionist orator. One of his mistress masters started to teach him how to read as a young slave boy until her husband halted her lessons. But she taught him just enough that he was able to break the literacy code, and with the help of neighborhood white playmates, he was able to steadily improve his reading comprehension. It was against the law in many states of the Deep South to teach black slaves how to read, and the fear was that education and literacy would broaden the horizons of the slave and ruin him as a slave as he yearned for the freedoms he read about. And for Frederick Douglass, this was indeed true. After several attempts, he managed to run away from Maryland to Boston in the 1830s. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint scripts that we upload to SlideShare. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Since he had a way with words, Frederick Douglass was asked to tell his story as an ex-slave at abolitionist rallies. Not only was he a leading abolitionist orator and writer, writing several best-selling books, including several editions of his autobiography, but he was also a leading black leader before, during, and after the Civil War, disproving by example the notion that ex-slaves were necessarily intellectually inferior to whites. In another video, Frederick Douglass, in his first autobiography, tells his white readers his life experiences as a slave in the Upper South. He discusses, among other topics, how slave families in the Upper South were often broken up, how breeding slaves to sell to the growing black belt plantations from Georgia to Alabama was often more profitable than using slaves to harvest crops in the exhausted soils of the region, how he barely knew his mother, and how he suspected that a master on a neighboring plantation was really his father, how savage beating and sexual abuse was often a way of life as a slave in the Deep South, how white masters could do what they wished with their property. Most of his first autobiography was included in the third autobiography written decades later, with some additional details on how he made his escape that were originally omitted, so he did not compromise the escape attempts of other slaves. And we talked about how he spent the first few years of freedom as a laborer on the Massachusetts docks. But these early decades of freedom were never carefree. Racial discrimination, segregation, and humiliation was present everywhere in the United States, in the North as well as in the South. And the differences were mainly due to differing economics. Slaves just not make good business sense up north. The Constitution also guaranteed that federal runaway slave laws would be enforced, which meant that all blacks, both freedmen and runaway slaves, had to worry that slave traders would kidnap them, legally or illegally, and ship them south to be sold into slavery. For example, the movie 12 Years a Slave is based on a true story where a black freedman was kidnapped from a northern state and was held as a slave for 12 years before the courts ordered that he be freed, since he'd been illegally enslaved. And this is a slide from the video on his autobiography. Frederick Douglass remembers, "In the South, I was a slave, thought of and spoken of as property, as chattel, as talking livestock. In the northern states, a fugitive slave was hunted like a felon, to be hurled into the terrible jaws of slavery, doomed by an inveterate prejudice against color, shut out from cabins on steamboats, refused admission to respectable hotels, caricatured, scorned, scoffed, mocked, and maltreated by anyone with a white skin." When William Lloyd Garrison, leading abolitionist and newspaper publisher, heard Douglass speak, he encouraged him to join the abolitionist movement. In 1843, the New England Anti-Slavery Society resolved to hold 100 conventions, and this was an abolitionist speaking tour from Vermont to New York and Indiana. They had varying degrees of success, but at Indiana they encountered a mob of 60 ruffians who tore down the speaker's platform, assaulted the speakers, knocked out some of their teeth, and as Frederick Douglass attempted to defend himself with a large stick, they scuffled and broke his arm. Soon after this, Frederick Douglass printed his first autobiography, and fearing for his freedom and safety, departed for refuge in England. He was denied a first-class cabin ticket on the steamship, but once aboard, the captain and the passengers invited him to give a lecture on slavery. Frederick Douglass remembers, "My visit to England did much for me in every way. Instead of a democratic government, I am under a monarchical government. I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man. I gaze around in vain for someone who will question my equal humanity, claim me as a slave, or offer me an insult. I employ a cab and I'm seated beside white people. I reach the hotel and I enter by the same door. I dine at the same table, and no one is offended. I find no difficulty in entering any place of worship, instruction, or amusement on equal terms with people as white as I ever saw in the United States. Nor did he hear in England those words he often heard in establishments in Boston. "We don't allow niggers in here." Frederick Douglass spent 2 years touring and speaking in England and Ireland. During his journey, his friends in England corresponded with his old master, Captain Auld, to accept £150 to formally ransom him from slavery. With his letters of manumission, Frederick Douglass had some protection from slave traders, although his notoriety was probably more protection than that. He was never completely safe from kidnapping. His friends also raised enough money for a printing press to publish the first newspaper with a colored publisher. Frederick Douglass told him that the greatest hindrance for the adoption of abolition principles by the people of the United States was the low estimate placed upon the Negro as a man. Because of his assumed natural inferiority, people reconciled themselves to his enslavement and oppression as inevitable, if not desirable. This equality disappeared once on board the ship bound for America. Frederick Douglass remembers, "It was rather hard after having enjoyed for so long a time equal social privileges, after dining with persons of great literary, social, political, and religious eminence, and never, during the whole time, having met with a single word, look, or gesture, which gave me the slightest reason to think my color was an offense to anyone, now to be cooped up in the stern of the Cambria, and deny the right to enter the saloon, lest my presence should disturb some democratic fellow passenger." Frederick Douglass named his paper the North Star. After the North Star, the runaway slaves followed at night in their flight to freedom. And on his return to America in 1847, it was initially published weekly, then it merged with another abolitionist paper, ceasing publication in 1860. Frederick Douglass remembers, "A slave brought up in the depths of ignorance, assuming to instruct the highly civilized people of the North in the principle of liberty, justice, and humanity. The thing looked absurd. Nevertheless, I persevered. And he had visitors who doubted that it was he who wrote his editorials. They expected that his articles and editorials were written by ghost white writers." His opinions diverged from those of William Lloyd Garrison, his abolitionist mentor. Frederick Douglass remembers that they both thought that the first duty of the non-slave-holding states was to dissolve the Union with slave-holding states. Now, Douglass later reconsidered, and that despite the 3/5 clause stipulating that a slave counted as 3/5 of a freedman, that the Constitution was in spirit an anti-slavery instrument demanding the abolition of slavery, that there was no necessity for dissolving the Union, and that the Constitution was not designed to maintain and perpetuate a system of rape and murder like slavery. During this time, he was also station master and conductor of the Underground Railroad, assisting fleeing runaway slaves in pursuit of their freedom, risking fines and imprisonment if he were caught. Frederick Douglass remembers that though it was a means of destroying slavery, it was like an attempt to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon. The thought was, if there was one less slave and one more freeman, having myself been a slave and a fugitive slave, it brought to my heart unspeakable joy. In 1859, on the eve of the Civil War, Frederick Douglass's life would again change after he met John Brown. He would once again be forced to flee to England for refuge and another speaking tour. John Brown was a firebrand abolitionist who waged war in bloody Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, recently passed by Congress, proclaimed that the voters could decide by referendum whether the new state of Kansas would be a slave state or a free state. This sounded like a good idea, but not so much. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces flocked to bleeding Kansas, and a mini-civil war erupted, and John Brown and his sons were in the thick of the armed struggle. Now the struggle there subsided, so Brown went east for fundraising and managed to raise some funds in arms, and met Douglass in Rochester, New York. Frederick Douglass describes John Brown like he was a character out of a novel. His eyes were bluish-gray, and in conversation they were full of light and fire. When on the street he moved with a long, springing, racehorse step, absorbed by his own reflections, neither seeking nor shunning observation. Such was the man whose name I heard in whispers. Such was the spirit of his house and family. Such was the house in which he lived. And such was Captain John Brown, whose name has now passed into history. as that of one of the most marked characters and greatest heroes known to American fame. Frederick Douglass remembers how after a Spartan dinner, he denounced slavery in look and in language fierce and bitter. He thought that the slaveholders had forfeited their right to live, that the slaves had the right to gain their liberty in any way they could, and did not believe that moral suasion would ever liberate the slave, or that political action would abolish the system. He said that he had long had a plan which could accomplish this end, and he invited me to his house to lay that plan before me. Now, John Brown was talking about armed insurrection and had this romantic notion that his armed band would gather in mountains, and that slaves would flock to his positions. The weak would escape north to freedom, and the strong would join their band of freedom fighters. And during this time, the increased enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Laws also raised tensions between North and South. And such excited talk raised the temperature, and abolitionist speakers, including Frederick Douglass, started raising the prospect that slaves would need to be freed through blood. Also, Frederick Douglass remembers, in the midst of these fugitive slave troubles came the book known as Uncle Tom's Cabin, a work of remarkable depth and power. Nothing could have suited the moral and human requirements of the hour. Its effect was amazing, instantaneous, and universal. No book on the subject of slavery had so generally and favorably touched the American heart. And we're going to be doing a video of that sometime in the future. And there was a Southern Companion's work to that was Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, and the slaves in Aunt Phyllis's cabin. Man, they're happy slaves. They're well-treated slaves. And slavery is just a wonderful thing. Then struck John Brown, Frederick Douglass tells us, on the night of October 16th, 1859. A party of 19 men, 14 white and 5 colored, brought with them a large supply of arms for themselves and anyone who might join them. And they invaded the town of Harper's Ferry, disarmed the watchman, took possession of the arsenal, rifle factory, armory, and arrested and imprisoned prominent citizens, collected 50 slaves, put bayonets in their hands, killed 3 men, proclaimed general emancipation, held the ground for more than 30 hours, but were subsequently overpowered and nearly killed by U.S. troops under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. Yes, that Robert E. Lee. And what effect did this have? Frederick Douglass remembers, raid upon Harper's Ferry was the last straw to the camel's back. What in the tone of Southern sentiment had been fierce before became furious and uncontrollable now. The scream for vengeance came up from all sections of the slave states and from great multitudes in the North. And most ominously, all who were supposed to have been in any way connected with John Brown were to be hunted down and surrendered to the tender mercies of the slave-holding and panic-stricken Virginians, and there to be tried under the fashion of John Brown's trial, and of course to be summarily executed. So, immediately, Frederick Douglass boarded a ship to England from Quebec, and requested that papers in his desk written by John Brown be secured. Now, what role did Frederick Douglass play in Harper's Ferry? John Brown had been a guest of many nights in his house. Douglass liked the idea of armed bands holding up in the mountains freeing slaves, but he desperately tried in vain to talk John Brown out of raiding Harper's Ferry. He definitely would not participate. Frederick Douglass told him that Harper's Ferry was a steel trap and predicted that Brown would not get out alive. And there was correspondence between them both. During the months following the raid, Frederick Douglass remembers Ralph Waldo Emerson's prediction that Brown's gallows would become like the cross, which was already being fulfilled. The old hero in the trial hour had behaved so grandly that men regarded him not as a murderer, but as a martyr. All over the North, men were singing the John Brown song. His body was in the dust, but his soul was marching on. His defeat was already assuming the form and pressure of victory, and his death was giving new life and power to the principles of justice and liberty. And now to talk a little bit about the Civil War and Reconstruction. After the start of the Civil War, and especially after the Emancipation Proclamation, freed blacks who lived in the North no longer needed to worry about whether slave traders would kidnap and enslave them. The clamor over the John Brown affair had calmed down by then. After emancipation, William Lloyd Garrison announced that the battle was over and tried, but did not succeed, to dissolve the American Anti-Slavery Society. But he did close down his newspaper, The Liberator. Frederick Douglass vigorously opposed this, and vigorously fought for civil rights for the newly freed blacks during the Reconstruction and Jim Crow redemption eras. And we like this illustration of the Emancipation Proclamation in Harper's Weekly because it tells what emancipation was from the freedman's viewpoint. It was freedom from whippings and torture and abuse from cruel masters. Instead, you got to vote, you got to send your kids to school, you got to have a normal job, and you could have real family life with reunions and happy things and just live like a normal person. Frederick Douglass continued to give lectures on civil rights. He wrote his third autobiography in 1881, which was also a bestseller, and started another newspaper. Now, he never held elective office, but he was appointed Marshal of the District of Columbia by President Hayes, which supplemented his retirement funds, and he had also been appointed as one of the members of a diplomatic team sent to Santo Domingo. During the Civil War, he consulted with President Lincoln on racial issues many times. Frederick Douglass lobbied Lincoln to permit black freedmen to join the army, and there were several black regiments after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, and after that he lobbied for equal pay for black soldiers. Frederick Douglass remembers his response. Lincoln began by saying that the employment of colored troops at all was a great gain to the colored people, that the measure could not have been successfully adopted at the beginning of the war, that the wisdom of making colored men soldiers was still doubted, that their enlistment was a serious offense to popular prejudice, that the fact that they would not receive the same pay as white soldiers seemed a necessary concession to smooth the way to their employment at all as soldiers, but that ultimately they would receive the same pay. Frederick Douglass recalls Lincoln's second inaugural address shortly before the end of the Civil War, when Lincoln proclaimed, "Fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continues until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toll shall be sunk, and every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." At the inaugural reception, 2 white policemen were guarding the door, and initially they refused to admit Frederick Douglass, saying they had instructions that no colored may enter. Douglass replied that he was quite sure that there must be some mistake, for no such order could have emanated from President Lincoln, and if he knew that I was at the door, he would desire my admission. And Frederick Douglass would not budge, so the policeman backed down and politely escorted him inside. Frederick Douglass was touched by how much deference President Lincoln showed him at the inaugural reception, this black man, famous though he was. And he also describes Lincoln like he's a character in a novel. Like a mountain pine high above all others, Mr. Lincoln stood, in his grand simplicity, in home-like beauty, recognizing me even before I reached him. He exclaimed so that all around could hear him, "Here comes my friend Douglass." Taking me by the hand, he said, "I am glad to see you in the crowd today, listening to my inaugural address. How did you like it?" I said, "Mr. Lincoln, I must not detain you with my poor opinion, when there are thousands waiting to shake hands with you." No, he said, "you must stop a little, Douglass. There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours. I want to know, what do you think of my speech?" And I replied, "Mr. Lincoln, it was a sacred effort." "I'm glad you liked it," Lincoln said, and I passed on, feeling that any man, however distinguished, might well regard himself honored by such an expression from such a man. When he remembers the sorrow he felt when Lincoln was assassinated, Frederick Douglass paints how he remembered the grand emancipator. "Lincoln always impressed me as a strong, earnest man, having no time or disposition to trifle, grappling with all his might the work he had in hand. The expression of his face was a blending of suffering with patience and fortitude. Men called him homely, and homely he was, but it was a manifestly human homeliness, for there was nothing of the tiger or other wild animal in him. His eyes had in them the tenderness of motherhood, and his mouth and other features the highest perfection of genuine manhood. His accusers, in whose opinion he was always too fast or too slow, too weak or too strong, too conciliatory or too aggressive, would soon become his admirers. And it was soon to be seen that he had conducted the affairs of the nation with singular wisdom, and with absolute fidelity to the great trust confided in him. Now Frederick Douglass, after the Civil War, after emancipation, understood that though the former slaves were now free, that they were not yet truly free. The freed man was freed from the individual master, but was still the slave of society. The black man had neither property, money, nor friends. He was free from the old plantation, but he had nothing but the dusty road under his feet. He was free from the old quarter that once gave him shelter, but a slave to rains of the summer and the frosts of the winter. He was, in a word, literally turned loose naked, hungry, and destitute to the open sky. Now the black man was not only truly free, he was also despised even more. And Frederick Douglass tells us, the first feeling towards him by the old master classes was full of bitterness and wrath. They resented his emancipation as an act of hostility towards them, and since they could not punish the emancipator, they felt like punishing the object which that act had emancipated. Furthermore, to guard and protect and maintain his liberty, the freed man should have the ballot, that the liberties of the American people were dependent upon the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. And of course we have the life and times of Frederick Douglass, which we've quoted from quite a bit. Very readable, very enjoyable, and you can purchase them for next to nothing on Amazon since they've long been out of copyright. The YouTube description, links to the video script and our blog. Please support our channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. And please click on the links for interesting videos on other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.